Okay.
That'll be my only maybe not work thing. Okay. So my name is Marilyn Robitaille. I am a teacher at Clark High School in Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board. Today I am wearing my sash, my Métis sash. The Métis sash it was traditionally used for all kinds of things. You can kind of see it's got a bunch of fringe at the end, and this could be used as thread or string for fixing things, for sewing. The actual sash itself could be used as a belt. It could be used as a rope. It could be used as something to, could be used as a bridle around a horse if a bridle broke. It could be used for all kinds of things, and it's a tool that they used, and it was hand woven. This one itself is machine made, but traditionally they're hand woven, and I have pictures later on of hand woven ones. So I'm wearing my Métis sash today, and I have the Métis flag behind me, and it's also on screen. So I will flip. Here we go. So I am Métis, but I didn't always know this. It's something that I've learned as an adult. For a long time, I didn't know what my heritage was on my mom's side, so my maternal grandmother's side. And this is very common for many Métis families, is to not know their history and their heritage for many years and just recently discover it in the last 20 to 30 years. And there's lots of reasons for this that I will explain in this presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is when I was in school. I feel kind of old doing this, but back in the day when I was in school, what did I learn from school about the Indigenous people and the Métis specifically? If anyone is watching and you remember grade 7 and 8, or if anyone's watching who is currently in grade 7 and 8, you'll probably remember learning about Louis Riel and the Red River Rebellion. Louis Riel Day, we just had it last Monday on November 16th, and Louis Riel Day didn't exist when I was in school. This year, the Kawartha Pine Ridge School Board raised a flag at the main building in Peterborough raised the Métis flag to acknowledge Louis Riel Day. And lots of schools and lots of cities across Canada did that as well. But that didn't exist when I was in school. Like many courses today, the history that I was taught was focused on the development and growth of Canada from a purely colonial standpoint. So it was talking about how the Canadian government was formed and how it expanded and took over what we now call Canada today. There was never any other side to the story when I was in school. Excuse me. There we go, get a drink there. So there's Louis Riel. My only memory of Louis Riel was the Red River Rebellion and the trial and execution of Louis Riel. One of the lessons that I remember was when we were able to, as a class, do a presentation and a reenactment of a mock court trial. And it was the trial of Louis Riel. And I remember every group, including myself, explaining or demonstrating that Louis Riel was a crazy, drunken half-breed. Anyone who supported him was also a drunken Indian, and that he was a threat to Canada that deserved to die. He was in the way. He and his people were stopping Canada from expanding to the west. And so he was declared guilty. Like the rest of the class, I celebrated when he was killed. Hooray, Canada won. We're so excited. Canada is the winner. We're able to continue settling to the west. After his death, it was like the Métis just disappeared. They were a blip in Canadian history, brushed aside, and never heard from again. But where did they go? What happened to the Métis people? I know now that we're still around. I'm alive. Métis people are alive today. Where did they go between now and then? So I accepted that the Métis disappeared, and they did, and I'll explain why. But in terms of the government and the colonial education system that I was raised in and that we still have today, they're talking about the colonial education system and the resources and everything that the teacher that taught me, that was all she had. And that was all every teacher had. So I can't even blame the teacher for teaching it badly, because that was what she was expected to teach. So after Louis Riel's death, there was a reign of terror against the Métis people. There was violence done to Métis people and the communities, and it was dangerous for anyone to publicly identify as Métis. They were a forgotten people. They turned inwards and endured many economic and political hardships. They were forced to live in poverty between the worlds. They weren't part of the First Nation Indian system with the reservations. They weren't part of Canada. They were left in between these two worlds. They were forced into poverty. Before his death, Louis Riel is quoted as stating, "My people will sleep for 100 years, but when they wake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back." And that was from July 4th, 1985. Or sorry, 1885. The Métis hid their language, Michif, and their traditions and their culture for generations. Métis children were told not to tell anyone that they were Métis. They were instead to say they were French. Right up until the late 1900s, so the past 30, 40 years, Métis were afraid to identify as being Métis because of discrimination. They would not be given jobs. They would be discriminated against. Their children could be taken away from them. It was not good to be Métis. But despite this, they still managed to keep their tradition, their language, and culture alive by hiding it. In 1982, which is 97 years after the quote that I just showed you with Louis Riel, the Métis were recognized as Indigenous in Canada under the Constitution. That was the first time they were recognized, was in 1982. In Ontario, it was not until 1994 that the Métis Nation of Ontario was formed. Various Métis nations exist in provinces across Canada, and this is the Ontario version of it. However, the Métis still had to fight for their rights. The constitutional rights of the Métis weren't recognized, and so what resulted in was a whole bunch of legal cases. Every time the Métis tried to assert their rights, they had to go to court. And so I'm going to talk about 3 court cases and some of the effects of those 3 cases. So the first one is Steve Powley. And I'm just going to read so I have the facts right. In 1993, Steve and his son, Roddy Powley, went hunting, and they shot a moose out of season. And they hung it in their garage so that everyone could see it. They wanted to assert their Métis right to hunt, to provide for their families. The Ministry of Natural Resources charged Steve Powley with hunting out of season, and they seized his gun, his truck, and the moose. The Métis Nation of Ontario supported Steve Powley, seeing this as a landmark case for Métis rights. It took 10 years of court fighting legal battles before a decision was handed down from the Supreme Court, the highest court in Canada. The Supreme Court ruling was that the Métis had the right to hunt out of season on traditional land, which is where Steve Powley lived, on traditional land. It was the first recognition of Métis rights in Canada, and the case started in 1993, and it was resolved in 2003, so 10 years later. After the Powley case, a man named Harry Daniels challenged the government in 2014. He wanted to know who had the responsibility for Métis people. And the reason he wanted to know is that the federal government said, oh, they're the responsibility of the provincial government. And the provincial government said, no, they're the responsibility of the federal government. So it was like this football they were kicking back and forth. No one would claim responsibility for dealing with the Métis people. So Mr. Daniels wanted the Supreme Court to decide who was responsible for the Métis, so the Métis could fight their rights with that part of the government. On April 14th, 2016, it's only 4 years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the federal government has the constitutional responsibility for Métis and non-status Indians. So that means the federal government, not the provincial governments, the federal government must now work with the Métis when the Métis are fighting for their rights. So they could no longer be bounced back and forth. And the last one is Thomas Isaac. In June of 2015, the Government of Canada commissioned Thomas Isaac to determine once and for all whether the Métis had rights under Section 35 of the Constitution and what those rights were. Mr. Isaac filed his report in 2017 and maintained that not only did the Métis have rights, but they needed to be allowed to exercise those rights. Those rights were constitutional rights under the Canadian Constitution, rights that we didn't have until now, didn't have recognized until now. His report was entitled A Matter of National and Constitutional Import, and there's a picture of his report. So what do these cases mean? First of all, these are not new ideas. These are rights that Louis Riel was fighting for over 100 years ago. It is important because Métis have been exercising hunting and fishing rights without prosecution, and it has led to groundbreaking negotiations between the federal government and the Métis across Canada. Métis are now in a position where they can negotiate directly with the federal government, and their needs are being met for the first time ever. They were never met 100 years ago with Louis Riel, and they were now being met after these cases. So how do I fit into all of this? How does this relate to me? So when I was growing up, when I was growing up, I had always heard that I was part Indian somewhere in my family. I didn't know where, I didn't know how, I just had kind of heard that story. I was always asked if I was Indian. I have dark hair, I have tan skin, I have dark brown eyes. People would always ask if I was Indian. My answer was always, I don't know. And that was the truth. I didn't know. We didn't know if we had any Indigenous family in our family. I was still asked that question in my adult years at university and in the workplace. And I truly did not know. I was not brought up with any information that I was Métis or Indigenous in any way. I didn't have any of the culture or traditions or knowledge growing up. But as an adult, my mom began her research. She found the Moon River Métis Council. She did not know her birth mother, but she knew that her mother was born in Moon River. So she went and found Moon River, which is along Georgian Bay, and she found the Moon River Métis Council. So she went there and they talked to some people who said, leave your information in our office and we'll try and get back to you and see if we can find any information to help you. A few days later, she got a phone call and the person on the other end of the phone said, hello, cousin. They were cousins. So my mom had found some family that she didn't know existed until now. She was an adult, I was an adult, and she was Métis. And that meant I was Métis. And not only that, as a kind of twist, at the same time we found out my husband was also Métis and his father was Métis. So all of a sudden we had all of this Métis culture, Métis information coming at us, and we didn't know what it meant. What does it mean? What is my culture? Who am I? Who are we as a family? And another question I had was, what happened to the Métis when Louis Riel died? Didn't the Métis die, or the Métis go away? Where did they come from? I've since learned all of this other information. So once my mother found out she was Métis, she exposed myself and my family to the Métis culture and traditions. We learned from this that we had a rich heritage and there was a great deal for us to learn as a family. So that is my son at 1 year old wearing his Métis outfit at a Métis rendezvous. It's a cultural event that I will talk about soon. We have been exposed to many cultural events. We've been exposed to jigging, to fiddling, to hand drumming. I learned more about the Métis culture, and I learned more about my culture. It's not just someone else's culture now, it's mine. I learned to love fiddling. My mom learned to do the hand drum. There she is with her drum. And there she is learning to fiddle. I have not learned to fiddle yet, but there she is learning to fiddle. And I've also done hand drumming with that's my other son. And so I've exposed my children to their Métis culture as they grow up. We then met and began to keep in touch with Louise. Louise was the person who was on the phone that said, "Hello, cousin," to my mom. So she's my mom's cousin. There's Louise and I at a Métis rendezvous. We have since met family that we didn't know existed through Louise and through other people. So now we have several other cousins of my mom's that we've met and built relationships with. We didn't know they existed until now. Through Louise, we were also introduced to a Métis community, the Moon River Métis community, my grandmother's community. Why had my mom not known her community and her family before? Well, growing up, as I said, she didn't know her mother, and she met her mother when she was an adult. My grandmother on her deathbed denied that she was Métis. She said she was Spanish. She looked the part. She had the dark hair and the dark eyes, but she wasn't Spanish. She was Métis. We now think that she was denying her heritage because of all the negative things that were associated with being Métis when she was growing up. But now we can all be proud of being Métis. This is where my family is from. I've learned that my family came from Drummond Island. And I hope you guys can see my pointer here. So there's Drummond Island. You can see it's actually on the American side of the border right now. But it used to be, before they made the border, it was occupied by Métis families. In the War of 1812, the British lost the island to the Americans. The Métis people who were loyal to Canada relocated across to the Georgian Bay and all the way down along the Georgian Bay, rather than staying on Drummond Island and becoming American citizens. So my family came along Georgian Bay and came to Moon River. My ancestors ended up in Moon River. My grandmother was born on an island in Moon River, and we are connected to 4 recognized family lines of Métis. In August of 2019, my mom and dad, that's my mom and dad there, They went to Drummond Island in Michigan to see the homestead and the fort where Fort Drummond was. So this is all that's left of the fort on Drummond Island. And that is the chimney and the fireplace. So that's all that's left. In 2005, I went to teachers college. I became a teacher. Nothing was mentioned in my program about Indigenous people or students during our courses. We talked about diversity, but never about Indigenous people. I told the teacher at the time that I was working with, who I was working with, and they knew nothing of Métis. I said I was meeting my Métis family. They knew nothing about Métis. They asked, do they have powwows like Indians? Do you sit around a fire? Do they dance? What do you do? And that was the first time I had been to a rendezvous, and I didn't know. So I said, I'll find out and I'll let you know. So I was about to learn. So at the rendezvous, there's my husband and I. There's lots of activities for all ages. So there's me helping at a children's activity table. They have lots of games for all ages. And there's my family at a rendezvous as well, my mom and dad and myself. There was also an Indigenous Peoples event at the Sky Dome, now called the Rogers Center, I believe, unless they've changed it again. But it's always the Sky Dome to me. In Toronto, so we got to participate in the grand entry. And there we are with our Métis sashes, and there was a big contingent of Métis people who walked in and were on the field with Indigenous people from all across Canada. Here are some fiddles. At the rendezvous, I found a vibrant culture, rich with music and lots of historical items that have been used. I found everything from fiddle music to jigging to traditional foods. I'll have a picture of some foods in a minute to show you. Over the years, this has become a favorite gathering. We've enjoyed going to the rendezvous every year. So there's some furs that have been caught. There's lots of historical items on the table. There's handmade baskets. It's probably a little hard for you guys to see. Here is traditional maple syrup gathering, maple sap gathering methods. So how they would drill a hole into the tree and collect syrup in the buckets. Here's some traditional guns and some axes, just historical items that have been used in the past that someone has kept. Here is a beaver pelt that was important in the fur trade of the 1700s. And so we are, they still do beaver pelts. And this is bannock. Bannock is like a heavy bread. It is delicious. It's like a biscuit. And it's really traditionally, it was cooked in a fire or wrapped on a stick over the fire. So this was bannock, fresh bannock, hot off the fire, and it's delicious, especially with a little bit of jam or some honey, and it's a great treat. In 2009, I was asked to start a Native Studies course at the school I was working at. It took a little bit of effort. We had to promote the school and get students interested in learning about Indigenous culture. I promoted it within my school, but then I went on maternity leave to have my son. When I came back, I found that resources that were used were taught in the colonial way. So, so-and-so conquered this colony at this date and time. And it's problematic because they didn't really discover the First Nations and communities. Those communities were there for a long time before Europeans came over. But the materials I had were still focused on the European perspective. But the curriculum was about modern Indigenous people and how do they fit into this framework that we have that's a colonial framework. So we ordered new textbooks for the course. And with those new textbooks, I ordered and received two that were published by an Indigenous publisher. And I began to flip through the textbooks and realized I saw a familiar face. My mom is in a textbook. And I don't know if you can see it here. I have the textbook here. There's the picture of my mom at a Métis harvest. So it says every September, a 10-day Ontario-wide Métis harvest is organized by the captain of the hunt and other Métis volunteers. The rendezvous is a time for Métis to gather and share with one another and celebrate the harvest. So this photo is a southern Georgian Bay, Moon River, fish fry and feast. Participants enjoy workshops, demonstrations, and entertainment. And there's my mom right there, looking at me from a page of a textbook. Not everyone can say they have family in a textbook. That's my claim to fame. And yes, I ordered her one for Christmas, so that was her Christmas present a couple of years ago. Anyway, so then with that new textbook, I started teaching the Native Studies course. And I taught this course for a few years, and I learned with students as we went, learning from First Nation and Métis people that I met along the way, and that shared with our class along the way, because I was still learning about my culture and my heritage. At the same time, I was teaching Indigenous culture and heritage to students. I went to various sessions at work and personally that helped with my development, both professionally and personally. I learned about residential schools because it was around 2009, 2010, the apology from 2008 by Stephen Harper, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, for the residential schools was still current news and brought new light to what happened. Oops, I don't want that yet. I didn't know when I was in school that residential schools were in effect while I was in school. So they still existed, they still had students enrolled in them. There were still horrible things happening when I was in school, in public school and high school. And that was a shock to me that no one had ever told me about it. No one had ever taught me about it. There was never any mention of it in history. So it's not old history, it's living history. It's history that's still around, that's still affecting people today. And as I talked with my class, we had lots of difficult discussions about residential schools and the things that happened and took place in those schools, not just to First Nations, but also to Métis and also to Inuit students. I also taught for the first time in a circle. And the desks in a classroom, the closest I could get was like a U shape. And so I'd put the desks in a U-shaped circle and sit at one end and try and connect the circle together. For those that don't know, the circle is a sacred thing to many Indigenous people. There's no beginning and no end. No one is before anyone. No one is behind anyone. Everyone has an equal say. Everyone is listened to. Everyone is respected in that circle. Everyone has an equal say. And even the Parliament in Nunavut is in a circle. So think of what the pictures you've probably seen from Queen's Park, from the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. They're very different. They're set with two sides, and the sides yell back and forth at each other. And some people are at the front and some people are at the back. Whereas in Indigenous communities, the circle is the way that they use to make decisions, to have meetings, and it's a great way for discussion. And so I do that in my classes. Unfortunately, right now with COVID-19, I can't do a circle because that would put everyone too close together. But circles are my favorite way of teaching now. I find it really easy to have discussions and for everyone to be heard and seen in a circle. In 2010, I went to the Louis Riel Day in Toronto. I took my school class, my Native Studies class. So we went to the City Hall for a flag raising, and then we went to Queen's Park for a ceremony about Louis Riel and the Métis. And 2010 was declared the year of the Métis, and it was 125 years since Louis Riel was killed. So 2010 was a really important year to be somewhere on Louis Riel Day. And so I took my class down. It was important to me to be at a ceremony recognizing Louis Riel on that day and to have my students there and participating in that. Over time, I've begun implementing Indigenous people into all of the courses that I teach. One of the interesting ones is stereotypes of mascots in marketing in business. So marketing the sports teams, for example, and branding the sports teams. And the importance of choosing culturally appropriate mascots. There's lots of teams that are called the Braves or the Indians or the Chiefs. And lots of people think it's a way to honor First Nations, but many Indigenous see no honor in a stereotyped cartoon or caricature of themselves. And it's a hot topic among sports fans and sports teams and sports players. And if you do some research on it, it's a really interesting, really hot topic debate. And so that's something that I've had in my business classes. It's more interesting that they understand that a caricature of someone else from a different ethnicity would be considered offensive. But when it's an Indigenous person in a caricature, people think it's okay. And I'm not sure why that is, but they do. I think it's because of all of the stereotypes that we've seen in media over many years that it's been acceptable in Canada and in North America. I also worked in English class by teaching poems and short stories and novels that were written by Indigenous authors. And that was sort of new for English courses, was to be looking at modern writers that had been things that had been written recently. And so the course kind of evolved from there. While I was teaching all of these things, I was never met with resistance, but rather I never thought of it that way. And that came from other teachers and it came from students as well. I never thought of it that way. I never knew that. As I started teaching differently, I taught some traditional Métis activities like dot art and finger weaving. And so here's some pictures of finger weaving. There's my mom learning to finger weave. And so when I talk about my sash that I'm wearing being machine made, there's what a finger woven sash looks like. That's a very small one, but they can be very large. We talked about the importance of looking at modern artists as examples of culture and community. And I was surprised how many students enjoyed doing Métis activities like dot art and the finger weaving. I've taught finger weaving a few times to different classes. It helps to lighten a course load that tends to be heavy with legal terms and court cases, but to give students a chance to actually make something and feel productive in terms of having something tangible in their hands they can hold up and say, I did this and I learned this. I find that went a long way. As I said earlier, Louis Riel is quoted as saying, his people will sleep for 100 years, but when they awake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back. Métis artists are being recognized more and more across Canada and across North America. Métis jig dancers are known for their dancing talent. Métis fiddlers, like the Métis Fiddler Quartet, are being recognized for their music talent. And here is a couple of videos that I want to show. So one is Sierra Noble, who is a singer-songwriter in Canada, a Canadian singer-songwriter, and she's a fiddler. Okay, am I back? Hopefully everyone got to hear that.
Sorry, Marilyn, the volume didn't come through, but when we repost this, I can add that video as well next to your presentation so people can watch it afterwards.
Okay, darn, so no one got to hear the fiddle music?
Not on my end, so I'm going to presume that it was the same for everyone else in the audience, I'm afraid.
Okay. Darn, because fiddle music, you can't help but tap your toes to it. So I guess I won't play the second video then if I know it won't work. It's an explanation of what jigging is and why it's important. It's, in summary, it's something that's been passed down from generations to generations. So the person who's jigging in this example talks about how she learned it from her parents and her grandparents, and she knows her great-grandparents jigged as well. And so it's just showing how the culture got passed down, even though it was hidden, even though it was kept from the public. It wasn't talked about outside of the home, but the families continued that tradition and that culture all the way through the generations. Métis artists, so when Louis Riel was talking about the artists, he's talking about all kinds of artists, artists in general, not just visual artists, but artists, musicians. But here is a visual artist, Christy Belcourt, who is very well known for her dot art. That picture, I don't know if you can tell, but it's all tiny dots. All those flowers, the blue jay, the hummingbirds, they're tiny dots that have made that image. And another artist is author Jessie Thistle, who recently wrote From the Ashes, and it's a best-selling novel that's out right now. He talks about the hardships that he faced as a Métis and how he rose from homelessness and substance abuse to become a professor in Toronto. And an author. So he is an inspiring story, and there's many more stories like that. In 2012, Idle No More was a political movement, and it helped me to mix current events with the curriculum and show that these issues are not past issues, they're not things from history long ago, but they're current issues. We talked about the issues of clean water on many reserves. We talked about the issues of third world living conditions and poverty for Indigenous people all across Canada. And likewise, there are many Métis who are fighting to come out of poverty, like Jessie Thistle. So the protests and rallies for Idle No More were really influential in bringing in some current events and getting students to connect with something that's going on right now in the real world. I think it is important to have diverse teaching, to learn from different cultures, different races, hear their stories, especially in English, to hear their stories and their voices. In KPR, we have Indigenous Peoples Awareness Month. And that's why I'm here, and that's why we're doing all of these webinars. Because we've observed Awareness Month for lots of other cultures and peoples, it's important to also talk about Indigenous people, and that was never talked about when I was in school. So it's nice that we have this month now to focus on it and to think about it and to raise awareness and talk about it. The most recent fights for equity among Black Lives Matter and Indigenous rights or human rights are also current events that have brought many issues of racism and inequity to the forefront. So that has let me bring in current events as well. There's still rights that are being fought for today. They're not old history. It's current history. I was thrilled to find out that there was a new English course being taught in Kawartha Pine Ridge. There was training and rethinking for both staff and students that needed to take place. So in the spring of 2019, I found out I would be teaching these courses, and I was excited to teach and share my Métis knowledge as well as some First Nation and Inuit knowledge to students and read authors from those three groups. I'm unique in that I am one of the teachers who is Indigenous and can teach the Indigenous course and bring a kind of a personal flair to it. Last year, I was asked to be on a TV segment from APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and the link isn't working because you guys won't hear sound. But hopefully that can be posted as well from Dean when this is recorded. And it was nice that the students got to talk about the different ways that they've experienced the course and the ways that it's changed their thinking. The new course teaches new concepts and new lessons that everyone can benefit from. I've taught 5 of these new courses now between last year and this year. And everyone can benefit from the different voices and the different values and the different teachings that we learned throughout the course. Students learn an awareness of a culture that is highly stereotyped, and we talk about the stereotypes and we challenge their stereotypes that they've seen in media. And one of the things that I really like doing is being able to offer students a smudge. I actually did that this morning with my students before this presentation. And smudging is when you burn sage to cleanse and clear your mind and your thoughts. I find students are often surprised at how quickly they feel calmer or less anxious or less stressed. And it's nice to offer that as a mental health technique as well. Students also gain an awareness of colonization and why we do things the way we do things. And we start to question, why do we do things the way we do things? And how can we change the systems? And this isn't just education systems, but it can apply to healthcare, it can apply to the justice system, It can apply to government. Lots of ways that we can kind of change the way that we've always done things. So what systems need to be changed? Why do we do things the way we do? Yes, I talked about that. Lessons that were learned from this course. So we talk about the 7 sacred teachings, the medicine wheel, the sacred medicines. There's a whole introduction unit in this course that I find really helpful to give students the foundation to be able to explore Indigenous voices. So I've taught in circles. I find there's a lot of discussion and more sharing among students. There's less leading from me, and it's more collaborative, which really reflects the Indigenous way rather than a colonial way. Students always give positive feedback at the end of the course. They're always impressed. I never knew this, or why didn't they teach us that before? Or something that kind of hits home and thinks like, why did I think that way? Or why did we do things that way? So there's always positive feedback of ways that they've been challenged. So we have come a long way from the beginning when I talked about the drunken stereotypes of Louis Riel and the Indians that supported him. But we still have lots to do. It lets me teach, which is something I love to do, and it lets me bring in the personal side of teaching and share parts of my story and parts of my history and my culture that I wouldn't otherwise get to share if I wasn't teaching this course. So it's really nice that I can do that. We've come a long way, but we still have lots to do. Thank you, Miigwech, Marcy, and I'll take questions now.
So Marcy, Marilyn, that was absolutely fantastic. For those people in the audience who may not be used to using this platform, if you look down at the bottom right of your screen, you'll see that you have a chance to click on your chat room. It might also be in the top right as well for some people taking a look. So Holly has said, thank you so much for sharing. There we go, starting off with Holly right away with kind words. And we have a question from Samuel. What are some rights you don't have that other people currently do?
So that would be talking in terms of the First Nation rights. So originally the First Nation rights to hunt, they can hunt and find their food and resources on their territory without having legal, without having a tag. If you're a hunter or someone who's ever been hunting, you know you need a tag to go hunting, and you buy a tag and you need a license and you put it on the deer or the moose. And you have to use that to claim that you're only hunting a certain number of deer or moose. And instead of having to go through that whole process that is governed by the government and regulated, First Nation people can just hunt for what they need, and they have that right. For a long time, the Métis didn't have that right at all. And then with the Powley case that I talked about, that's when the rights are starting to come in, that they have the right to hunt on traditional land. I'm not saying I can go and hunt just anywhere, but if I'm on traditional land and it's part of my family land, where my community is from, then I can hunt in that place outside of season to provide for my family, because that's our traditional way of hunting and eating wild game rather than going to the store and buying food or buying meat. Does that kind of help?
I think on answering on behalf of Samuel, yes, it does. So merci for that, Marilyn. Shirley is asking, what is the difference between a First Nations person and a Métis person?
Okay, so First Nations are what you guys might have heard called as Indians. So First Nations are the people that were here before Europeans came over. When the Europeans came over and they met the First Nations people, some of the Europeans and First Nations had families together. So their families became this blend of First Nation and European people. And the community became a separate community. It was not European and it was not First Nation. It was a combination of the two, and it became their own community. And they formed their own language with Mischief, which is a combination of English, French, and First Nation languages. And they share some traditions from both First Nation and the Europeans. And if you look at the infinity symbol behind me, that's the Métis flag, and that's showing the joining of the two groups and forever intertwining.
So merci for that, Marilyn. And also to Shirley for the question. I think we only have time for one more, Marilyn, because even though you were worried about using up the hour, you did a fantastic job. So before we get to the last question, Clay is saying thanks and that this was very intriguing. And the last question, and Shirley is also saying thank you. Good explanation. Chloe has said that was great. Thank you for sharing with all of us. And now here is our last question from Holly's class. Her grade 10 history class was wondering if Métis people participated in the world wars, because we can understand why they wouldn't.
I believe they did, yes. There are some, if you Google the, do some searching on the Indigenous Veterans Day, which I believe is November 8th, I think it was this year. You can find lots of information on Indigenous veterans, and the Métis people did fight because this is their land. They did fight in the world wars. And there are Métis people who are veterans. There are Métis people who are serving right now. There are Métis people who have been involved in all that. In the war, even as far back as the War of 1812, they fought for the British, for what was going to be Canada's side against the Americans. So yes, they do fight in battles.
So again, merci, Marilyn. This was fantastic. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your preparation. And thank you outside of this presentation for the bravery and the thoughtfulness you exemplify every day as one of the teachers of the NBE, and all of our NBE teachers. They're blazing new trails. So it's awesome that you're sharing your story to show all of these teachers how important it is, and that there's a relevance to this course. It's not just curriculum, but it's impacting our personal lives. Did you have any closing words that you wanted to say, Marilyn? Because I'd like to leave it with you, and then we will finish up.
Okay, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for attending and for listening. I hope that you've learned something from this and that you enjoyed the presentation. And Miigwech, Marcy, thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Yes, have a great day.